So welcome to our COVID-19 Global Conversation Series. The series is hosted by the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies in Seattle. And I am Reşat Kasaba, the director of the Jackson School. Our purpose in convening this series is to contact our colleagues in different parts of the world and get a sense from them as to how they're experiencing this extraordinary period that we're going through in our global history. We are very privileged to have colleagues, former students in all different parts of the world, and we're able to draw on their experiences and expertise. So I'm very pleased today to be hosting Professor Işık Özel. Işık Özel is teaching political science at Carlos III University in Madrid, Spain. Prior to that, she held teaching positions in Istanbul, in Berlin, in Madrid again, Barcelona, and Mexico City. Professor Özel is a proud graduate of the University of Washington. She has a Ph.D. in political science from our university. And her work, her research is mostly on institutional change in developing countries, market regulation, social policy, focusing especially on education. Işık, thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So this is a wide-ranging conversation, but our main interest, of course, is to get some personal reflection on what's going on. But I'd like to start with this question of why Spain? Why is it that Spain, in addition to Italy, emerged as one of the countries that was most heavily hit by this virus early on? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you, Reşat. So Spain and Italy actually share a few things in the context of this crisis. First connection might be, or might have been, the soccer connection, actually. So in February 19th of this year, in the midst of the corona crisis, or the coronavirus already had started expanding in Italy at least. So there was a soccer game played in Milan between Valencia, a soccer team from Spain, and Atlanta, a soccer team from Italy. So that became one of the channels through which the virus actually got carried to Spain. So another connection, of course, besides soccer, these countries share a few things. Tourism. So Spain is the second largest country in receiving tourists. So 82,000 tourists, I think, last year came to visit Spain. So connectivity, that means connectivity. That means a lot of people are passing by Spain, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and what have you. And yet another connection is demographics. So Italy and Spain have very actually old or much older populations than the world average. So very high life expectancies. Italy is the champion along with Japan. And Spain comes after Italy with 83 years average of life expectancy. I just checked the United States, that is, I think United States has 79 years. So old population, a lot of people living in nursing homes. Another thing that they share, that these two Mediterranean countries do share between them, is the intergenerational contact, which the Northern European countries generally lack, or not to, they do not have it to that extent. Meaning, so people do visit their parents, grandparents at nursing homes very often. They live together. I checked the data of the young people younger than 35 years old, and 50% of those people in Spain do live with their parents. So the ratio is 10% in Germany, for instance. So part of it comes from the family ties, cultural elements, but the other part comes from the economic crisis. So these people do not have the means to live alone, actually, and that shows one of the continuing impacts of the 2008-2009 crisis. So they have to live with their parents. So we should avoid romanticized pictures of the big families in Italy and Spain, and take into consideration the economic dynamics as well. So, of course, culture, having said culture, social distancing is very limited here as a cultural element. So people do share food and hang out together. Again, different age groups hang out together a lot, like in Italy. So that is much more limited in Northern Europe compared to the Southern Europe. So a warm culture, people hug and kiss and share life, and they're out and about. So street life is very vibrant. So those things, those elements, I guess, are quite common between the two countries. But one last element, or again common between Italy and Spain, is the collapse of the health system. And this can be argued for a lot of other countries as well. But here in Spain, there's an additional element to unpreparedness of the health system. And Spain is known with having a quite well-established public health system based on universal coverage and free coverage to all citizens. But given the federal-like system, almost de facto federal system, and this is not a federal system, but then there are 17 autonomous communities, regional governments, and normally, in normal times, health falls into their authority, meaning the provision and distribution of PPEs, personal protection equipment, are actually in their authority. And in after the crisis started in Spain, so the state of emergency and centralization of power, of course, centralized the provision and distribution of such equipment, and the government failed to coordinate with the regional governments, and the government did not have the resources actually to supply such equipment. And in addition to the limited capacity as to intensive care units, as to the number of beds, as to the number of doctors and nurses, and as to the numbers of ventilators, such structural element also played a role in the coordination failures. So we have now, unfortunately, the highest death rate in the world, and only in Madrid, 7,000 people died so far, and in the whole country, almost 20,000 died. 20,000 people lost their lives, and so actually 7,000 in Madrid is almost double the total number of people who lost their lives in the whole China, if we can, of course, trust the figures of all governments, right?
Thank you. Are you in complete lockdown now, or what is your status right now?
Yeah, the lockdown started on the 14th of March, and so it got stricter after 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks, and so we had a complete lockdown for 2 weeks, including the Easter. After the Easter, so the measures loosened a bit, but only for some businesses, only for some sectors, like construction sector, for instance, started working back again. But we're still in lockdown, and we're allowed to go out for food and for urgent needs, and pharmacies are open, supermarkets are open, but you have to have a shopping bag in hand so that the police officers would not stop you. So otherwise, it's quite strictly implemented. I mean, the measures unfortunately started quite late. And as I said, all those travels and so for soccer games or other events and cultural events, and the 8th of March International Women's Day protests convened 120,000 people in Madrid. So then the measures started, or the lockdown started late in the game. So that was a failure of the government, actually. But then after it started, it's been implemented quite well, quite strictly.
So can you, I mean, you say you mentioned the soccer game was in February, did you mention?
Yeah, February 19th, yeah.
So it is just about 2 months. It's not a terribly long period of time.
Yeah.
Can you tell us when you first became aware of this and then realized that it can be a really big problem for Spain and for your own life? And what was that progress like? And also, if you can tell us what is the main source of information in Spain about the progress of this disease? In this country, we're relying on research institutions, especially Johns Hopkins University is a main source of, found out that even the government is trying to get its information from them. So so can you just tell me how you became aware of it, where you get your information? What was this 2 months like?
We first, of course, we were getting the information from the media of the virus and of the pandemic in China, right? So, but in the very first case in Spain, I think emerged on the 31st of January. So the very first death was on 13th of February. So that was someone who traveled to Nepal, got back from Nepal, and despite the fact that in Nepal there was only one case registered at the time, so he got sick and unfortunately he lost his life. So then after, I would say, we heard about it in January, but we heard about it as a remote problem, right? So then in February, though, you know, just because it had started in Spain already, the cases and the death, we started hearing about it more. But to the extent that we would be worried about it, and we would demand some more measures from the government already, I think it was March. Early March, like the very first days of March, or maybe late February. And the central source of information is the Ministry of Health. Ministry of Health has a unit called emergency, the Center of Emergency, Health Emergency. So they have updated information despite the fact that that information has been questioned, particularly by the opposition. So that they do not, they cannot collect the accurate numbers. They cannot then yield the accurate numbers, and so on. And so there are research institutes as well. There's a national research institute in Spain. So we get some information from that institute as well. However, the numbers as such and how the disease proceeds in Spain, we get that information from the Ministry of Health.
So here we have in this country now, there is a sense that we're gradually moving towards a flatter version of this famous curve, plateau, people refer to it as. Although, of course, that's a very tenuous kind of situation, and it varies in different parts of the country, but there is a sense that we are moving in the right direction, at least in many of the states that took early action, like our state here, Washington. What is the sense in Spain? I mean, you said that there's a gradual opening of some businesses now. Is that happening because of the pressure, or is there now a general sense that perhaps this can be managed in an environment like that?
Yeah, I would say both. So the curve started to flatten here too. I think we've seen the peak already. So at the highest point of the peak, some 950 people lost their lives on one day, and now we have 580, 550 or so in the last couple of days. So it's still, of course, the number of the cases is still increasing, but the rate of increase decelerated. The rate of increase diminished. So it's not like how it was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So it's and there is, I think, increased capacity in terms of the health system's response to the crisis. There's more PPE, and its distribution is maintained in a better fashion. And also, there's even, beds available in the intensive care units, which was a major problem a couple of weeks ago. So it's compared to how we were in the beginning of the lockdown, it's much better. But then you never know. We cannot foresee, as we know from the Spanish flu's case a century ago, right? So then we talk about the probability of mutation, right? So if it mutates and if it appears again in fall, so that will be another disaster. Back in the time, some 270,000 people had died in Spain only, and in 1 month only 117,000 people had died, October 1918, I guess it was. I hope it will be controlled. I hope in a century from the flu we learned something, and I hope so the flattening of the curve will continue like this.
So I'd like to move and kind of talk about the politics of this a little bit. Of course, Spain is now recognized as a successful, stable democracy. But at the same time, in recent years, we've been following the various political problems and conflicts, especially in relationship to the Catalan region. So can you tell us a little bit about the possible political effect of this crisis? How is it likely to affect the politics in Spain?
Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, the existing problems, for instance, the polarization, increasing polarization in the society, will intensify further. So the Catalan crisis, as you mentioned, the pro-independence crisis and the tension between the Catalan the regional Catalan government and the central government, actually is not as bad as I would have thought that it would be in the context of such a major crisis, but still there's tension there. So I can only, I can only suppose that this crisis will intensify further, but the Catalan crisis had caused the emergence of far-right parties, the emergence of extremist politics in Spain already. So then in the ideological spectrum, you did not have those parties before, but then they emerged in the last couple of years, and they're quite strongly expanding lately. And now they're they're in opposition, but then fiercely opposing the government. And the government is a coalition government, which is the first coalition government in Spanish history. And it's a very young government. It got established in January. So
in the coalition, it's between the
socialists and Podemos. So socialists can be considered as a left of center party, but Podemos is an unapologetic left-wing party. So now the left-wing coalition that we have is under attack. Based on their crisis management and based on the coordination failures that they've caused or experienced because of the structural problems, as I mentioned earlier, the de facto federal system status of the autonomous communities, actually. So, of course, such contestation of the current government, of the coalition government, will intensify or has intensified already. So the polarization in the society will reflect this in the future. But I do not expect, at least like democratic consolidation has taken place in Spain. So then in a lot of other countries, democratic institutions might be shaken out of this crisis. I don't expect a crisis to that extent. So only the coalition government will be questioned even further. And the Catalan crisis might re-emerge after the Corona crisis. And and the social and political polarization will worsen even further.
Okay, let me just broaden our focus a little bit and ask you, put your political science hat, and all of us are, of course, realizing that this is one of those extraordinary periods that we're going through, and it's likely to have far-reaching effects on global relationships, institutions, and how we live our lives. So as a political scientist, how do you see the impact of this? Do you think the sort of international system, both economic and political, has enough strength to survive and rebuild after this? Or do you see this as one of those epical kind of events that will usher in we don't know what, but perhaps a new alignment in the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the skeptics of globalization will be empowered during and after this crisis. And so nationalisms, new waves of nationalisms might appear after this crisis or even during this crisis. It depends on the duration of this crisis, and it depends on how the crisis is managed, particularly in the, in the powerful countries. So skeptics can easily blame interconnectivity as the root cause of the coronavirus pandemics, right? And so polarization on the world scale, and also polarization in the major advanced industrialized countries will intensify, as it will in Spain. And some regimes might change, and we might see regime changes in positive direction, but also in quite scary directions as well. So I hope that we won't have major regime changes in the autocratic direction. And as to the international organizations or international regime as such, so it all depends on how the international organizations and the regimes are respected and maintained during the crisis. And so then the stances, the respective stances of the United States, of China, of the European Union, or particular countries in the European Union and Japan. So those stances are very important in order to be able to say something about the sort of sustained status of the organizations and the regimes after the crisis. And of course, the rivalry, the power rivalry that we've been observing in the global scale will intensify. Many estimates in normal times before the corona crisis estimated that China will be the largest economy, will have the largest economy by 2030. So if the corona crisis continues for a while, so we might see the further growth of China and the Chinese economy is becoming the largest economy even earlier than 2030. But even this, given the interconnection that we have, interdependence that we have, even this depends on, I mean, China's success depends on the United States' quick recovery and the European economy's quick recovery and the other emerging powers' quick recovery, because China, after all, depends on the world economy, depends on the export markets. But the rivalry will intensify, that is for sure. And the postures, the stances of the major powers regarding the international organizations and regarding their meaning and regarding their operations and their effectiveness, then will determine the milieu that we might see after the crisis.
Thank you. Let me finally ask a more personal question. So I mean, as we know, you mentioned this earlier already, Southern European countries have a reputation for being very, very social. We think about crowds, we think about big families, we think about this constant sort of interaction. By necessity, of course, cities tend to be, especially the older parts, very congested. And this is a radical change. And it came at a very short time in how people are supposed to live their lives. And so can you sort of reflect on that a little bit, how you and also your friends, people you know, how people are coping with this?
Mm-hmm. It's very hard, as you said, in a very social culture like Spain's, it's very hard to cope with that. So we live in apartments and apartment buildings, and especially in big cities, right? So it's and everyone from all age groups and from all social groups, and everyone actually enjoys the socialization, the street life, and the markets and the bars and all that, the festivals. And so if now people are coping with it based on different strategies, of course, there's a lot of interaction going on. So there's a lot of Zooming going on. So then we have our tapas over Zoom over the weekends, and we have actually several dates with friends over the weekends especially. So that continues. But then if that becomes, after the lockdown, hopefully, if that becomes face-to-face, so we don't know if we will be back to the normal soon enough. So meaning if we can go out so often after the lockdown, or if we can go out without the masks, if we can do bar hopping, if we can socialize with family and friends so often. So that is, of course, subject to question. We'll get to see. But a radical change over the long term, I'm not sure if that is possible in Spain. So of course, it depends on how long this crisis will last. So if it lasts for a long time, and if it actually causes even more suffering in the society, maybe the long-term causes might be great as well. But then my guess is that, so if the lockdown ends, and after the lockdown ends, of course it will end one day, so people will be very cautious about the measures, and some, of course, some insulation and some measures like masks and so on, and limited socialization. But then that will be over after a few months or a year or two. I mean, that's my guess, of course. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
This is very informative. Thank you for taking the time and talking to us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yes, and let me just thank the audience, people who tuned in to listen. This is the first in the series, as I mentioned, the global conversations on coronavirus. We are going to have similar conversations with colleagues from other parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa in the coming days and weeks. You can get more information about the series and listen to these recordings at jsis.washington.edu. That's our website. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again, Professor Özel, for this very interesting conversation. Thanks.
My pleasure.